Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced, and you're listening to Economics and Finance for Noobs. So this is gonna be like sort of the first sort of real actual episode. And I just kind of wanted to set like a lot of what I want to talk about is economics, and a lot of what I want to talk about is more like economic theory and what is economics. Um, so I guess we should start with that. Like, what is economics, and why do you care about economics? Now you'll talk to different people who are economists or economic thinkers, and they'll tell you different things that economics is, whether it's just the study of exchange, the study of economic, of basically exchange. Um, I generally like the Austrian economics definition of economics, where it's like the study of human action. Okay. And again, bottom line is like one thing you'll learn about as you go into the economics field is that just like pretty much any body of language, there's people who are really dedicated to sort of certain ways of thinking about the things or certain schools of thought to the point where they can be unpleasant if you try to venture outside of it. That goes for pretty much all camps, like, different political ideologies, different economic philosophies, different health philosophies, different religious ideologies. They generally, there's people who are like very, very dedicated to a particular set of practices. Don't let that deter you from gaining from the benefits that any of these bodies of thought and knowledge can provide, because they all generally do have insights you can gain from. Okay, just because I do know that like when people start delving deeper into economics, sometimes they can run into like groups of people who may not take too kindly to certain questions or certain you know taking into consideration certain possibilities. So, but you also will find many people who are excited to just share the insights they have and aren't necessarily so. Always just take that as a grain of salt in life in general. Uh, but I personally lean very heavily on like my sort of background on how I came to economics, learn more about economics from really starting with the Austrian tradition and branching out from there. And the reason I like that, I like the Austrian tradition, is because it focuses at a very, very base level, which allows you to really have the building blocks for kind of understanding how everything else works. Because your fundamental building block is essentially an individual choosing to act. So, like me wanting to go buy a CD, okay? And the essential assumption is so essentially from the Austrian point of view, and why it's called the Austrian School of Economics, just because the original sort of group of economists that founded this way of thinking or developed this way of thinking were all from Austria. That's the reason why. It doesn't mean they're all from Austria or that it's currently based out of Austria. Um, for the most part, I think a lot of it's for the most part become much more U.S. based economists for those who do practice it. Um, but basically, essentially, the idea is that people do things with a purpose. So if you want to understand why two people exchange goods, um, you have to understand sort of their motivations. Okay, so starting with this whole idea that like what determines activity is going to be a lot about the individual's intentions and motivations, which has a lot of implication when you're trying to understand phenomena. Because a lot of times what you see practice, sort of the mainline economics is macroeconomics, where you take a look at large institutions and treat them as if they were individuals. So you take a look at why does company X do this, but it goes deeper because the company X is made up of lots of different people who have different interests. So like the CEO may have said to do this, but the person they told to do it has different motivations, so they maybe implemented it a little bit differently. So you end up with this situation that on at the higher level doesn't make sense. It's like, why would company do Y when their motivation was X? But when you start really thinking about like the individuals and the individual mix and the reasons they make decisions, you start getting a much clearer picture. It is more work on the brain. Okay, it does take a lot more work to have to think that through. But I do find like a lot of value in that. So to me, like that's going to be like sort of the basis at which we build up everything else. So individuals take action, whatnot. Okay, so that's what economics is, just basically studying why individuals sort of act and exchange. Um, and in that, all economic activity is essentially one party exchanging something to another and like, trying to understand why that happens. So then we start asking questions about like value. Okay, so you have this like debate between like sort of the idea of an objective value, meaning certain things are just worth what they're worth. This is where you start having people who make claims that like X is underpaid or X is overvalued. Um, then you have, again, the Austrian tradition takes the point of view of where things are subjectively valued. Okay, so the reason why a football player may be getting paid more than a teacher is because of the subjective value, not the absolute whatever's going on in the world, but the people who are paying feel like they're getting their money's worth, thus they're getting X. Okay, and then again, this raises questions like, well, don't people feel like they're getting value for teachers and whatnot? And it's going to come down to like, again, that individual who is actually making that choice to spend those funds and their motivations. Because again, if you just look at it at that high level, you miss a lot of that individual picture. But essentially, that's the idea. Like, why is bread worth so much per loaf? Is because somebody feels it was worth paying it. Because if I didn't feel it was worth paying it, or thought it was worth paying it, it doesn't mean I'm correct. Because a lot of times we buy things and we find out afterwards, like, yeah, that wasn't worth what I paid for it. But you go into the transaction expecting that you're going to be better off than you were. So things can't have an objective value because basically if things had an objective value, so for example, you wanted to sell me something, so because if you have something that's worth $5 and I have $5, I'm not going to buy it from you because I'm not better off. I got $5 worth of something. But if you have something that to me sort of psychologically is worth $6, but you're charging me $5, but to you it's only worth $4, okay, but as far as the way you feel about it, then what's going to happen is that when I buy it from you, you're better off because you now have $5 worth of value when you had 4 before, but me, I now have something that I value at $6, so we're both better off. And that's kind of like the fundamental insight there, in the sense that at least at the point of where we intend to enter an exchange, we always do it intending that we're both better off. Like you wouldn't, you're better off than you would be had you not entered the exchange. Okay, so why does someone do something? Because they think they would be better off doing it than if they had not done it. So let's start there. So basically, with those building blocks of just thinking about how individuals behave and what, because people will tell you like, I think this is better. I think this is what I should have done, but that's not what they did. So that means there was some sort of calculation they made at the moment, and they truly felt like this decision was better. Now again, we can start taking a look at different biases that people might have. Like you think of like sunken cost bias, or people who are biased from loss versus gain. And we'll explore all this stuff as the podcast goes on. But the idea is that you start looking at human interactions and human decisions from this framework, people's decisions start making a lot more sense. And then you start thinking of like larger organizations' decisions start making a lot more sense. And the world starts making a lot more sense. Like you're not like, the world isn't so infuriating anymore. You're not like, oh, the world's a big mess. You're just like, okay, yeah, that's kind of what I should expect. It makes sense. And that's going to be the beauty of like learning more about economics, but also throughout this podcast, I hope to talk more about finance, to understand sort of like, again, investment and sort of the way people value things in a more formal way, so that way, you can take action on it when you're trying to think about like investing and allocating your own capital in life. So hopefully you guys find this interesting so far. If you like it, subscribe to the podcast, tell your friends about the podcast, and have a great day and enjoy.